the data dilute, in my opinion, is both an opportunity and a threat, at least if you don't get it right. I mean, with all the data that flows from connected devices, the first question you will ask is this personal data? And since that's a very broad concept of personal data, the question is whether the privacy regulation kick in, and if they do, you have loads of compliance obligations which you need to observe. So this can certainly be a pain, this can certainly restrict you in the way how you can use data, etc. So therefore, you really have to be careful to be compliant with the laws. On the other hand, of course, it's a huge opportunity. This is also one of the results from the report, where 80% of the respondents say that the biggest opportunity they see from IoT, which is basically enabled through new connectivity, is a more sophisticated data analysis, data analytics. So there are loads of opportunities analyzing all these data, putting them together from different sources, and drawing conclusions in order to improve products, to improve services, etc. Exploitation of big data for commercial purposes is a complicated thing, actually. You need to look at, can you do it in a compliant way? How can you comply with data protection law requirements? So you can avoid all these complications if you only deal with anonymous data. And now I see that's really a tricky point, because in the beginning sometimes data is attributable to an individual, and then you have to anonymize the data. And there we see those anonymization concepts. They bring about, in many cases, agreements which you conclude, for example, with certain providers of technology, just to ensure that you don't get access to certain data which could lead to identifiability of the data. So you have these anonymization agreements. Certainly you have data sharing agreements. So once you have a data set which you can commercialize, there's no ownership right in data. So you can't rely on a right to certain data. You have to conclude agreements which set out who is allowed to use certain data, for which purposes are they allowed to use them, what technical measures need to be implemented, and also under which circumstances must data be deleted, for example. The main legal issues around exploitation of big data, as I said, the first thing is really, am I entitled to use the data? Is it my data, actually? For example, if you look at the connected car and the data that's produced in these connected cars, a very valid question is, who's the owner of the data? Who's allowed to use it, actually? Is it the car manufacturer? Is it the operator of the car, if you have a fleet? Or is it the driver? So, and coming from there, you first have to solve the question of, am I allowed to use the data? For which purposes am I allowed to use it? So it's data ownership, basically. You certainly have data protection law aspects, data privacy. What are the boundaries? Do I need a consent from the affected individuals, or do I have a legal basis, a contract, for example, for which I can use it? So I think these are the main two aspects. But also there are competition aspects, for example, because I can use this data to shut out competition. For example, if I use the data to direct a driver of a car to a certain garage, because I know from the data that flows from the car in the course of predictive maintenance that in 100 kilometers the brakes will shut down, and then there can pop up a screen and say, okay, go to this garage now, and so I can also try to cut out competition, which raises competition aspects as well. So loads of legal issues, actually. I feel positive about the next wave of connectivity, because I think, in my personal view, actually the opportunities really weigh out the threats, and it's just something that will be coming, and businesses have to adapt to those developments. And these are just interesting business models, and they'll affect our day-to-day life. I mean, we're already used to using a smartphone for many things, but with the advent of the Internet of Things, I think it will be very, very interesting to see all these connected devices and the possibilities you have. And it also brings about new business models and new opportunities, which really are for the good. For example, there's the huge project we are assisting with around. It's a big data project in the healthcare fields where the purpose is to improve medicine for cancer, because you're using all this data from different sources to be able to get better treatment. So I think there's also many good things about this.